Hello and welcome to Cosmological Arguments. I'm your host, John Bannon. Debunking Atheism, Volume 7. One of the things you should be aware of is there are people in our society who wish to eliminate the concept of God from our common collective consciousness. They want to stop people from believing in God, Jesus, Muhammad, Moses, the Bible. They want people to never even learn of these things to begin with. So these people are a very serious threat to theism and the belief in the existence of God. You should take that threat very seriously. Do what you can to counter that threat. One of the best things that you can do is learn the cosmological arguments and tell them to other people so that other people have the cosmological arguments as a basis for their belief in the existence of God. You know, human culture at one point in time didn't believe in God. So, because human culture once did not believe in God, there's no reason why that couldn't happen a second time. And there are forces and people in our society and in our world who would like to go back to that godless time. So be aware that that's what you're up against. And in our modern age where global communication is such an easy thing to do, it makes that threat even greater because they have a much easier way of spreading their atheistic and secular ideas. So, you should be putting up the good fight against these forces, and don't let them win. For the basic reason that God is real and deserves your worship. And these forces don't recognize that, and they need to be countered. Um, okay. Another thing is that nobody has the right, except you, to decide for yourself whether God exists. Never concede that right to another person. And it doesn't matter what expertise that person has, whether that person is an academic philosopher, a scientist, any sort of authority figure, any sort of academic, any sort of expert. They do not have the right to decide for you whether God exists. You have the right to decide whether God exists for yourself on whatever reasoning or feelings you want to base that on. And that's just a truth. Don't ever cede your right to somebody else. They don't have that right. Okay, so I'm going to address two more atheistic arguments, and I'm going to show you how to get out of them. First atheistic argument is the argument that the universe changes. Matter, energy, it all changes. God can't exist because God is uncaused and cannot change. Because an uncaused thing is not made of parts, and therefore it doesn't have parts to move. So it can't change. Therefore, God can't cause change that we see in the universe. Uh, so an unchanging thing cannot cause change. Uh, Therefore, God could not have created change or the universe. Therefore, there's no reason for God's existence. God doesn't exist. Okay, so what's the answer to this atheistic argument? Well, the answer is this, that the cosmological arguments themselves prove the necessity of an uncaused metaphysical cause of physical reality that we call God. So, because this uncaused cause is necessary for physical reality to begin or to exist, then it must cause the change that we see in the universe. Has to. It's a necessary thing for its existence, so it has to cause the change. And it's a mystery how it does it. It's inexplicable, but nevertheless, because it's necessary, it must cause change. So the answer really is, well, just because you can't explain how it causes change doesn't mean it doesn't cause change. It's inexplicable, it's mysterious, but necessary nonetheless. So this sort of atheistic argument is really just defeated by the cosmological arguments themselves. Um, so, an uncaused metaphysical cause is an inexplicable, mysterious thing. There's no doubt about it. But you can also look at something physical like the photon, for instance. We know the photon is real because it's light, and we know light is real. Anyone with a flashlight knows that light is real. And yet, under general relativity, Einstein's theory of the macrophysics world, the photon is a timeless entity. It can appear and disappear, even though it does not experience time. So a photon can be emitted from an atom's electron shell, and it can also be absorbed by an atom's electron shell. So it can appear and disappear. But it does not experience time under general relativity. So there's an example of something that we know exists, and yet doesn't make logical sense. How can something appear and disappear and yet be timeless? That would mean it both exists and doesn't exist simultaneously. Well, that seems impossible. And yet, there it is. There's the photon, and it does that. So even though something is seemingly impossible, doesn't mean it doesn't actually happen. The photon is a great example of that. We know photons exist. It shouldn't be able to appear and disappear and not be subject to time, and yet that's exactly what it does. Seemingly impossible, but nonetheless real. God is the same thing. Seemingly impossible, and yet real, which means God, despite not being able to change, nevertheless can create change. Cosmological arguments prove that. The second atheistic argument I want to go through states this. So first, if nothingness were ever a state of being, it would never have changed from that because something cannot come from nothing. So that's pretty obvious. If nothingness were the case, since you can't get something from nothing, nothingness would still be the case. Number two, therefore, because nothingness has never been the state of being, then the state of being must have always been something, or physical reality. So this is creating a dichotomy between nothingness versus somethingness. So because it's not nothingness, because if it was nothingness, nothingness would still be the case and you wouldn't be here. It has to be somethingness. And in this argument, somethingness means physical reality, space, time, energy, mass, quantum field, um, photons, energy, you name it, but physical reality. So number three, because physical reality must always have existed, then no cause for its existence is necessary. So it's setting up this dichotomy between nothingness and somethingness, meaning physical reality. Because it's not nothingness, it must be somethingness, which means physical reality must have always existed, must have always been the case. And if it must be the case, then it doesn't need a cause for its existence. It's essentially an uncaused state of being, physical reality, because it must always exist. It must be there. So the conclusion is that God being the cause of physical reality is unnecessary and does not exist, because under this argument, physical reality is an uncaused state that must exist, so it doesn't need a cause. And God being defined as that necessary cause for physical reality doesn't need to exist, because physical reality itself is an uncaused state. No God needed. Okay, so how do you get out of this argument? The way out of this argument is this dichotomy. This is a false dichotomy. A dichotomy is two things which are mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive of all possibilities. Now, if this dichotomy is missing a possibility, then it is not a true dichotomy. This is missing a possibility, and the possibility it's missing is God, the uncaused metaphysical cause of physical reality, or the uncaused non-physical reality. So it's not including that. And because that's a possibility, a real possibility, and it doesn't include it, then this is a false dichotomy. So it's missing the uncaused non-physical reality, which, by the way, we call God. Now, the atheists will say, well, we don't have to include this in the dichotomy because that's not real. That's impossible. It's nonsense. It's non sequitur. It doesn't make it. It's ridiculous. So it's not a real possibility. We don't have to include it in the dichotomy. And your answer to that is, well, you're wrong. It isn't ridiculous. It is, in fact, realistic possibility. And not only that, it's a necessary truth. And then what do you point to? You point to the cosmological arguments to prove that this is true. This is a real thing, and that this dichotomy has to account for it. And because it doesn't, it's a false dichotomy, and this whole argument ends up being invalid. So, to a great extent, the cosmological arguments are really about invalidating this argument and this false dichotomy, or invalidating this dichotomy, proving it false. So that's how you get out of it. It's simply not the case that physical reality does not require a cause, and that a state of physical reality is an uncaused state. That is false. It is logically false. The cosmological arguments prove that, and they prove the necessity of an uncaused metaphysical cause that we call God. So, I hope you learned something, and understand that there are some atheists or non-believers who are generally interested in these sorts of discussions, and they're not a significant threat to the belief in God by others. But there are other forces in our society which would like to eliminate God from everybody's consciousness, and don't let that happen. Fight against them. Another thing is, when you argue with atheists, it can get, pretty tense, because you're countering each other's moves and their logical moves, and it's rife with potential mistakes that you might make. Don't be put off by that too much. I'm giving you a lot of the arguments that you can make against non-believers, and these are tested in time. They're time-tested arguments, but you can also learn a lot by arguing with people who don't agree with you, non-believers. It'll help you refine your own arguments, and it may even be the inspiration for a new argument for the existence of God that you hadn't thought of before. Because in counteracting an atheistic argument, it may make you think of something that you hadn't thought of before, which actually supports your argument that God exists. So there is an extent to arguing with non-believers or atheists is a worthwhile exercise in terms of you better discovering the truth and better discovering the best arguments to make for the existence of God. So, the arguing with non-believers and atheists is not for the weak of heart, and you have to accept the idea that there is going to be challenges to your basic beliefs, but you have to be strong enough not to worry about that. If you're not one of those people, I wouldn't argue with non-believers and atheists. Let somebody else do it, like me, who can handle it, or somebody else who can handle it. But otherwise, it can be very, very enlightening and very useful for you to discover new things and understand, have a better, stronger basis for your belief in the existence of God. Okay. I hope you learned something, and take care.